the Aguna crisis contextualized, I address the plight of the Aguna. So the Aguna, okay, cool. The Aguna is a woman who is trapped within her marriage because her husband refuses to grant her a get, a Jewish bill of divorce. And the Aguna crisis is a direct product of the patriarchal nature of Orthodox Jewish divorce law. Keep this up here. Just to give you a sense of the scope and magnitude of the Aguna crisis, there are an estimated 15,000 agunot in New York State alone. And although only a select number of Orthodox Jewish women self-identify as agunot, these numbers don't account for the widespread phenomenon of get extortion. In Israel, for example, 50% of the Orthodox Jewish men involved in divorce proceedings threaten to withhold gets from their wives in order to arrive at the most favorable divorce settlement. So the Aguna crisis really has universal resonance and implications because it underscores the challenge that women face when a pre-modern religious legal system is transposed into the context of a modern liberal society. And the question guiding my thesis is this: how can the Orthodox Jewish community, with its fealty to a pre-modern legal canon, accommodate modernity's demand for gender equality in confronting the Aguna crisis? Aguna advocates typically employ one of three solution methods in order to resolve the crisis: a Jewish legal method, a civil legal method, or a social method. And the three chapters that make up the body of my thesis address each of these methods respectively. Also respectfully, in my opinion. So, chapter 1 deals with the prospects of a Jewish legal solution. I argue that key rabbinic figures conceive of Jewish law as a timeless and unchanging system that is incapable of adapting to remedy the Aguna crisis. Primarily, the argument in chapter 1 serves to frame the analyses in chapters 2 and 3. For its conclusion, raises a seemingly intractable theological problem for the Orthodox rabbinate. If Jewish law is truly timeless and perfect, then how could it possibly engender the innocent Aguna's plight? In other words, the Aguna crisis appears to impeach the alleged divinity of Jewish law. While chapters 2 and 3 show that the civil and social methods fail as thoroughgoing solutions to the Aguna crisis, they play a critical and complex role in minimizing the tension between the Aguna crisis and the Orthodox rabbinate's conception of Jewish law. So chapter 2, civil legal method. So in chapter 2, I focus on the New York civil get legislation and its particular popularity among the Orthodox rabbinate. My analysis explores why Orthodox rabbis who believe that Jewish law is timeless and unchanging then decide to turn to civil law in order to solve the Aguna crisis. This would seem to imply that American law is more just than God's law. While the Orthodox rabbinate addressed this problem by developing what I term a theology of exilic powerlessness. And this belief involves a commitment to the fact that Jewish law is timeless and it's perfect and it's divine, but that it can only function as such when the Jewish people are redeemed from a state of exile. So, in other words, the Aguna crisis does not reflect a deficiency in Jewish law, but is simply a function of the Jews' exilic circumstance. And this theology really unburdens the rabbis of the responsibility to solve the Aguna crisis. So I conclude by arguing that while on the surface, civil get legislation appears to aid the Agunot, it actually reinforces an exilic theology that sustains and justifies the Aguna crisis. In chapter 3, the social method, I move away from the legal mechanisms of the first two chapters to consider the effects of social power on the Aguna. Here too, I argue that while what on the surface appears to be a solution for the Aguna crisis, actually subverts the interests of Agunot as a group. I begin by arguing that the Orthodox rabbinate, in order to defend the divinity of Jewish law, employs rhetoric that distorts the nature of the Aguna crisis. This rhetoric blames the recalcitrant husbands for the Aguna crisis instead of Jewish law's structural inequalities. And my main claim is that the social method distracts the Orthodox Jewish community from the root of the Aguna crisis and from the fact that it is rabbis alone who have the power to solve the crisis. I conclude by pointing out that while the social method has helped a select number of Agunot, it simultaneously harms Agunot as a group by reinforcing rabbinic distortions of the scope and the nature of the Aguna crisis. And as you can see on this slide, this is the webpage of Israel Meir Kim, who's a recalcitrant husband. And if you read this webpage, just glance through it quickly, it shows how hard Aguna advocates have to work it shows how Aguna activists, in order to garner opposition against the recalcitrant husband, they have to depict him as the only one to blame in the Aguna situation. They can't blame rabbis, and they have to only blame the recalcitrant husband. So to sum up, my thesis contributes to Aguna scholarship by focusing on attitudes engendered by civil and social methods endorsed by the Orthodox rabbinate. On the surface, these methods appear to aid the Aguna. They appear to aid the Aguna and to underscore the rabbinate's efforts to free Agunot. But upon closer scrutiny, these very methods reinforce the sorts of rabbinic apologetics and distortions that direct responsibility for the crisis away from the Orthodox rabbinate and Jewish law's structural inequalities. Ultimately, my thesis offers two fundamentally different strategies that religious leaders use to navigate the tension between pre-modern patriarchy and contemporary liberalism. The first, reflected in the Jewish legal method, involves an assumption of responsibility and a willingness to creatively confront the moral problems that are produced by religious law. And the second, the civil and social method, involves an eschewal and redirection of that responsibility to anyone and anything other than the religious establishment. Thank you.
What happens to a woman in such a predicament who goes out and gets a civil divorce?
So she would definitely be considered civilly divorced by the United States and everything, but for the religious community, she would be exactly this. She would be considered an aguna until her husband decides to give her a get.
So there isn't a groundswell of support for these women who take it into their own hands to be divorced?
There is in the form of the social method, but my thesis was mostly about how I still think that that social method is impeding the ability of a solution from emerging. So yeah, there is support, but not enough, and the law needs to change.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
So, is it are there community, I don't know too much about how Judaism is organized in the United States. I mean, is it have to be a single set of rabbis who change the law, or aren't there different groups that might change the law or not change the law?
Yeah. There are a lot of groups that want to change the law, and some do, and they could, except it all comes down to the problem of MAH00043, which is like illegitimacy. So if agunot go to their rabbis or people who want things to change, and they say you are no longer an agunah, and they redeem them from their marriage, if that woman then goes and has a child, there's a large a large constituency of rabbis who will say that her child is illegitimate. So even though there are people that want things to change, it ultimately has to be the rabbis with the most influence and the widest constituencies, and they're usually the most right-wing and unwilling to change the law. So there would be a schism within Orthodoxy or within Judaism in terms of who's Jewish and who's not. Because these illegitimate people can only marry illegitimate people, and it's a whole to-do. So.
Has illegitimate sons.
Yeah.
I have a question about calling it a crisis.
Mm-hmm.
Can one make the argument that you can't question divine law anyway? I mean, to say that divine law comes up wanting simply because it doesn't align with the values of a modern liberal state sort of suggests that in some ways the modern liberal state has the ability to exercise judgment upon divine law. But if divine law is divine law, then whether it comes out problematically gendered doesn't necessarily matter, does it?
I agree with you that divine law is untouchable, except it was rabbis, like humans, that made up that law that ultimately, I don't want to say they created the Agunah crisis, but structured law in such a way that it was possible. So I'm not asking the Bible to change as much as to look for loopholes in rabbinic literature in the same way that in which that has been done on a lot of other accounts. Like, according to the Bible, Jews aren't allowed to charge each other interest. Well, they do. So, so it's just a matter of pressuring, sort of pushing the right buttons. Also, something that I'd like to do further research on is the degree to which gender plays a role, which it does a major one in this crisis, because I'm curious about whether maybe rabbis who are men haven't come up with a solution yet, because it's not affecting them, even though it is affecting them, because if there's illegitimate people walking around, that affects the community as a whole and its total, functioning. But maybe they're not feeling it as much since they're the ones that are able to remarry or participate in polygamy according to the Bible. Not that they do, but there's an out for them. So.
They could do what the Catholics have done, which is there's the sacrament of marriage, which is immutable and handed down by God, divine, but they developed a methodology that was extremely loose and sloppy on Catholic, and simply let people out the door by mostly, not all, but mostly the fiction that the marriage never existed, and this includes, married forever and ever and ever when you can be forever.
Yeah.
So that methodology is helpful to a great number of people, and yet it leaves the sanctity and holiness of marriage to exist for those who want it and will follow it.
It's really interesting that you say that, because one of the methods for redeeming an agunah that was previously practiced was just that, to look to rabbinic literature for a paradigm. I'm trying to think of how to explain this. There's a concept in rabbinic literature of a mistaken sale, that if the two parties, if there wasn't full disclosure, then the sale has been nullified. So that model has been applied to marriage in order to free agunot. And that's actually what a lot of my thesis is about, because the more prominent rabbi with the larger constituency vetoed that method, and it's considered not viable now. But that's the beginning of the process of looking for solutions within rabbinic literature, solutions just like that. So we're looking for another one.